Dr. Jaisun Fung is a fully board certified kidney specialist. He, however, has also a great interest in the use of low carbohydrate diets in the management of obesity and diabetes. I first became aware of Dr. Fung when I observed a lecture he gave on the internet, and I was absolutely astonished that someone could come along and say that the way we manage diabetes is incorrect and that giving insulin may be more harmful than helpful. And that is the basis of this lecture. He's looking at the conventional treatment of type 1 and type 2 diabetes with insulin and asking the question, are we harming the patients because we're giving them medications that don't really make a difference, when if we would simply reduce the carbohydrate intake, we might be doing much more for their health.
All right, so I'm going to change things up a little bit here. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about pathophysiology. And like what Gary was saying yesterday, what we're going to do is look for anomalies and really see if we can fit that into our framework to really come up with a more robust theory of obesity. So this is the way we look at things right now. So, I mean, the calorie thing, I mean, that's just not right. So insulin is what really drives obesity. That's pretty clear. And we say that carbohydrates leads to increased insulin. And as a theory, it's not bad, but there's a few problems with it. So if you look at it, it doesn't account for a few things. First of all, it doesn't account for the time dependence of obesity. What that means is that if you think about how people become obese, it takes decades. Most of them are eating about the same number of calories, same number of carbohydrates, but slowly they get 2 pounds, 1 pound a year, and it adds up. The other thing about time dependence is that if you think about weight loss, those people who have been obese for 20, 30, 40 years have a much harder time losing that weight. And this sort of theory doesn't actually allow for that, because if you cut your carbs, you should cut your insulin and you should lose the weight. But I don't think that's true. And I think people who have struggled with their weight loss for many years would probably agree. The other thing about it is that there's some studies that almost contradict what we're talking about. And the most obvious of these is the Chinese rice eater. Okay, so this is the Intermap study, and it was a very detailed study of dietary habits in the US, UK, Japan, and China. And you can see in China, whether you're looking at grams per day or percent calories, they're eating a lot of carbohydrates. Okay, so that's 360 grams a day. And it's all white rice. It's not brown rice. I mean, I can ask my parents, I can ask my grandparents. They don't eat brown rice now, right? It's all white rice. So they didn't have much obesity back then. They do now. But back then in the early 90s, mid 90s, they didn't have that much obesity. But they were eating a ton of white rice. So why is that? The key, of course, is the sugar. They eat very, very little sugar. Japan is the same. You can see they eat about the same amount of carbohydrates, but they eat much less sugar. So there's something about the sugar that is particularly obesogenic. But what is it? The other problem is a study done by a Swedish fellow, Stefan Lindberg, who studied the Keflavins, which is an island off of New Guinea, and what he found in the early 1990s was that they ate a lot of carbohydrates. And they're eating a lot of starchy vegetables, tubers, roots, vegetables, 69% carbohydrates. Very little sugar, all unrefined, but again, very little obesity. So here you have another case where you're just eating a lot of carbohydrates, but no obesity. So how does that work? And really, we have to explain that before we can actually take this theory and go the next step and understand what's happening with weight gain. What is the etiology of obesity? That's what we need to know. So in order to understand that, you actually have to know about insulin resistance, right? Because this is, where's the light? This one? Oh, so there's insulin resistance. And why do we care? Well, because insulin resistance leads to increased insulin. Remember, it's not quite the carbs that leads to obesity. It's the insulin that leads to obesity. You know that because when you give insulin, people gain weight, right? And here we are, a huge amount of insulin resistance, and that's going to lead to increased insulin. So that might throw a wrench into the works, and we have to be able to understand what's going on here. So this is insulin resistance. Just a brief summary. What happens is that insulin normally brings glucose into the cell, and when it doesn't bring the glucose into the cell, the glucose piles up. The body, to deal with all that extra glucose, makes more insulin. And we care again because all that extra insulin is going to lead to more obesity. So the question is, how do we get that insulin resistance in the first place? That's crucial. You have to know what causes it. So we don't even know where to start to look. So we can back up a little bit. And we can start by looking at other biological systems. And let's say, what causes antibiotic resistance, for instance? Well, the answer to that is antibiotics, right? So you give antibiotics, they develop resistance, and then you get resistance. What causes resistance of viruses? Well, viruses do. So viral resistance is caused by viruses. So again, that's the whole point of a vaccine, right? You give a vaccine, it's a virus. So you develop resistance to the virus. If you look at drugs, marijuana, for instance, Colorado's favorite, you can look at it, and what happens is that the first time you take it, you get this big high. And then with each successive time, you get a little less and a little less. And in drug parlance, that's actually called tolerance, but really it's just another name for resistance. So in other words, drugs cause drug resistance. And this is the fundamental biological principle known as homeostasis, right? So the body has a certain state that it wants to be at. And once you move away from that state, it tries to bring it back. So this is not just for marijuana. It actually happens for all kinds of drugs. So nicotine, nitroglycerin, alcohol, benzodiazepines, all of those drugs, cocaine, marijuana. But it's the drug itself that causes resistance. So we take advantage of this, actually, with our drug therapeutics. Because if you talk about ADD kids, so attention deficit hyperactivity, these are hyper kids. And what do? You give them Ritalin, which is methylphenidate, okay? And it's a stimulant. It's not a sedative, it's a stimulant. So you might think, well, why are you giving a stimulant to these hyperactive kids? And the answer, of course, is that you develop resistance. As you develop resistance to the effect of the stimulant, these kids aren't so hyper, and it works, right? So we know this happens, and we know why it happens. You downregulate the receptors. Whenever you have high persistent levels of a hormone or a drug or antibiotics or viruses, you develop resistance. So the thing about these is that they're all self-reinforcing cycles, also known as a vicious cycle. So as you get exposure, so say, let's take antibiotics. So if you have antibiotics, it's going to cause resistance. So the knee-jerk reaction is to give more antibiotics, right? Because now you're going to have to use more to overcome this. That, of course, is a terrible idea because you're going to get more resistance. So if you keep using more and more antibiotics, you're actually going to get worse and worse over time. So the answer is actually the exact opposite, right? To use very little antibiotics. But that's not what we do in most cases. The knee-jerk reaction is not. So the first place we actually want to look for what causes insulin resistance is insulin itself. Does insulin cause insulin resistance? And this is the thing. You can look at the data, and we can take patients with insulinoma. So this is a very rare tumor, which in the absence of most other diseases just secretes a lot of insulin, right? That's the whole pathophysiology. And what you see is that as the insulinoma secretes more and more insulin, so these are higher and higher insulin, you get more and more resistance. And that's a good thing. Because if you didn't develop that resistance, what would happen is your sugars would go very low, you'd have a seizure, and then you die. So the body is actually protecting itself. It's a homeostatic mechanism. And as you take out those tumors, the insulin resistance actually fades away. right? So that's exactly what we're talking about. But the key point here is that insulin causes insulin resistance. You can actually do this to healthy young men. So you can take healthy young men and infuse insulin. And what you do, this is called a euglycemic clamp. So you just kind of give them higher and higher doses of insulin. You give them higher and higher doses of glucose so they don't become hypoglycemic. And then after a few hours, usually a day or 2 days, you measure how well they utilize the glucose. And what you see is that there's a big drop, about a 15% drop. And this is after like 2 or 3 days. That means you've already developed about 15% insulin resistance in these healthy young men. Now this study, which was done in 1985, used supraphysiologic doses, but you can use physiologic doses. And Del Prado did that in 1994. And what he showed was that you could take physiologic levels of insulin and you could just infuse it over 96 hours. These are healthy young men, right? Like 20-year-olds, right? And what happens is that you get about a 20 to 25% reduction in insulin sensitivity. In other words, we're not talking about correlation anymore. We're talking causation, right? Because we did this to people. We gave insulin, and they got insulin resistance. You can actually look at it in type 2 diabetics as well. So there's an interesting study from 1993. So this was the days where they said, oh, you have to control your blood sugars. You have to control your blood sugars. So they took a group of people, and they started off here with 0 insulin, okay? And they just piled on the insulin, gave them tons. The blood glucose was terrific. They went in 6 months from 0 units to 100 units a day. Sugars were great. They also gained about 20 pounds, 8.7 kilos, even as they reduced their calories about 300 calories a day. Why? Because insulin drives obesity. It's not calories, that was just dumb. It's the insulin. You gotta have insulin. So obviously these people have reduced their intake, but their metabolism has slowed even more for them to gain that weight. It's a lot of weight. But that's not the point. The point is to look at the glucose disposal rate. That's how well you use the glucose. It's a measure of insulin resistance. As you give more and more insulin, the insulin resistance goes up and up. So, again, proof again that insulin causes insulin resistance. And this is Dr. David Ludwig from Harvard, and he acknowledges in this paper that you've got this vicious cycle here where the hyperinsulinemia is driving the resistance, but the resistance is driving the insulinemia, a classic vicious cycle. And the longer you stay on this, the worse it gets. So we have to think about why you develop the insulin resistance. So this is what insulin does, right? So you eat, insulin goes up, and you store sugar in the liver, glycogen, right? When that's full, you start making fat, which is called de novo lipogenesis. When you don't eat, then you're fasting, you decrease your insulin, and some of that fat comes out, some of that sugar comes out. That's the normal situation. That's all good, right? But what happens when you have a lot of insulin all the time? So this is the normal situation again. So you've got food under insulin, you're eating, it's high insulin, it goes in, right? It goes in nice and easy. You store the sugar, store the fat. When it's low insulin, that comes out as energy. But what happens when you have high persistent insulin? Well, the liver becomes full of sugar. Glycogen stores are full. You've got de novo lipogenesis, but you've got this big fatty liver. So now this is the situation here. So what you have instead is a big fatty liver, and you're trying to stuff more fat into this big fatty liver. Well, that's hard, right? It's kind of like you got your suitcase and it's full, and you're trying to throw in a couple more sweaters, right? It's really hard. So for the same amount of, insulin, it's just harder to push in, right? So it's just like when you're blowing into that overinflated balloon. You have to blow a lot harder to move the same amount of air. This insulin has to work a lot harder to move the same amount of glucose in because it's stuffed full already. That's insulin resistance. So it's the fatty liver that causes the hepatic insulin resistance. And what happens when your insulin goes low? Well, all this sugar comes whooshing out. And what happens is that your blood sugars go high. So what you do is your doctor gives you a ton of insulin and keeps it all bottled up in this big fatty liver, right? But that's not a very good strategy. But it's important to understand that it's the fatty liver that causes this insulin resistance. And you know this because if you look at the West of Scotland study, you can take archived blood and you can say this is a diagnosis of diabetes right here. There's two groups, one that developed it, one that didn't. And the people that developed diabetes, their ALT, a measure of their liver enzyme, has been going up and up. Those people that didn't, did not. So what's happening is these authors call it the long silent scream from the liver, because you're shoving all this fat into this fatty liver. And the liver's just groaning, but you don't hear it, it's a silent scream. But when you do the blood work, you can actually see this rise in ALT. So it's a fatty liver that's causing it. And you can actually get rid of that hepatic fat because that's the first fat to go out. So if you give people a very, very low-calorie diet, like a 500-calorie-a-day diet, well, what happens is that the liver fat goes first, long before the subcutaneous fat goes, because it's more accessible, right? So you can lose about 30% of your fat in about 6 weeks, 12 weeks, most of it in the first 2 weeks, actually. This is super low-calorie diets, 500 calories a day or so. And what happens to the insulin sensitivity? Well, it goes back to normal, right? So here's the normal insulin sensitivity. This is before you'd lose all that weight with the super low-calorie diet, and then afterwards it goes kind of right back up. So the insulin sensitivity gets restored as you pull all this fat out because it was the fatty liver that caused the insulin resistance. And what caused the fatty liver in the first place was the insulin itself. So you can correlate again very closely, 7.7, the insulin dose that you give and the percent liver fat. So the more insulin you give, the more fat in the liver, right? And if you look at type 1 diabetes, which is almost the exact opposite situation, you have low insulin levels and low liver fat. So there's a very good correlation. And it's probably more than a correlation, it's probably a direct cause and effect. So now instead of this one-way street that we have, which is probably not true because nothing in medicine works like that, right? So if you have, say, heart attacks, you don't say smoking heart attack, right? There's a ton of things that cause heart attacks, right? So it's the same thing. Fattening carbohydrates, the refined carbohydrates, do cause a rise in insulin levels, but they're not the only thing that causes a rise in the insulin levels. And that's a mistake because the insulin resistance itself causes high insulin levels. The high insulin levels goes back and causes resistance, and you keep going back and forth. And this is what causes the time dependence, right? This gets worse over time. The fat get fatter. The people who have done a lot of this are going to have a lot of trouble because this pathway is not diet dependent, right? The question is, which comes first? It's a very interesting chicken and egg problem because did this come first or this come first? Well, you can actually study this in juvenile diabetes, which they did. And what they did was they took a group of people. There's three juvenile groups. There's one that's non-obese, and there's one group that's short-term obesity, and there's a long-term obesity group. And what they found was that the non-obese group doesn't have a very high insulin level. So that makes sense, right? Because insulin drives obesity, so the non-obese people have low insulin. Perfect. And the same with the glucose. The glucose is a little higher. But what happens to insulin resistance? So this is insulin resistance, maximal glucose uptake, and you can see that the insulin resistance only develops over time. The insulin is there first, but over time you get this decrease in insulin sensitivity. The longer you have obesity, the worse your insulin resistance. And this is the reflection on the fasting plasma insulin, because what happens, of course, is that as you get more and more resistance, your fasting level goes up and up. So this is crucial to understand, because what happens now is that this is the key. How are you going to treat obesity? well, you need to find out what's causing my high insulin levels, right? But it's not all about the carbohydrates. It's about the insulin resistance, as Jay was getting at. And the high insulin resistance, of course, is the disease of diabetes, type 2, right? So this is the thing. These are related diseases. But the obesity does not cause the diabetes, because every time they try and look and find out how does obesity cause diabetes, they never find it, because it doesn't. These are both diseases of hyperinsulinemia, right? The other thing to understand about resistance is that there's two key features in resistance. There's high levels, right? And there's the persistence of those levels. And again, you can look and see, how do you prevent tolerance? How do we stop from being insulin resistant all the time? Well, the key is that this happens for all hormones, right? So cortisol, insulin, parathyroid hormone, growth hormone, everything. Every single hormone is released in bursts. So you have very low levels, you get a burst of growth hormone, then it goes to very low levels. So you don't have a persistence of those levels. So that's how you prevent the development of resistance. And this is what happens when we eat, right? When you eat 3 meals a day with no snacks, what happens? The insulin goes up, then it goes down, up and down, up and down. But you have this long period where you're fasting, right? Somewhere between 12 hours, 14 hours, whenever you eat dinner and whenever you eat breakfast, where your insulin levels are actually quite low. And that's very important, because that is going to prevent the development of resistance. And we know this again because we use it in therapeutics all the time. So this is a nitro patch. And what happens with a nitro patch is that you put it on and it slowly releases nitroglycerin. If you leave it on 24 hours a day, it just doesn't work, because you develop resistance. So what do? We put it on in the morning and take it off at night. So that long period of low nitroglycerin is going to prevent the development of resistance. So this is the thing. We have high insulin levels, but we need more than that. We need persistence of those insulin levels. So what's been happening since 1977 with how often we eat? Because that's crucial. Because it's not simply a question of what we're eating, it's a question of when we're eating, right? It's always two questions, like if you make $10,000, well, that's great. Is it in a year? In a day? It makes a big difference. So what's been happening with meal frequency or meal timing? Well, the short answer is we are eating way too fucking much, right? So here is 1977. This is our parents' day, right? 3 meals a day, no snacks. You try and come home and have a snack, your mom's like, don't eat a snack. You're going to ruin your dinner, right? Now it's like, here, have an after-school snack, right? And we went from 3 meals a day, no snacks, to 2003. I mean, there's a midpoint here, where you're talking about 5 to 6 meals a day, right? So now what you have is you've actually fulfilled the 2 prerequisites to develop insulin resistance. So what you have is high levels, because you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, but also you have the persistence of those levels. And that's what's going to give you insulin resistance. So instead of this, what we have is this. It's completely unbalanced, right? So here is balance, right? So say you eat at 8 o'clock in the morning, breakfast, then you eat at 6 o'clock at night. So there's about, 10 hours there and 14 hours of fasting. That 14 hours of fasting is going to prevent the development of resistance. Now, people tell you, oh, you got to eat as soon as you get up, then eat some more, and eat 6 times a day, and grace throughout the day, and eat before you go to bed. Well, you have gone from a balanced situation where you have balanced the insulin dominant and the insulin deficient, right? So this is insulin dominant, insulin deficient. and you've gone to like 80% insulin dominant, what's going to happen? You're going to develop insulin resistance. You're going to have a lot of high insulin. You're going to get fat. That's exactly what happened, right? And these are the changes that we've made since 1977, right? You don't have to go any further back. And this is what happens over time, right? This is hormonal obesity because it's all about hormones, right? The calorie thing, that was just a big mistake. But it's about insulin. So when you're 10, you have a little bit of insulin resistance and a little bit of insulin. As you go on, you get more and more and more. And pretty soon, what happens after 40 years is that this is now the major driver. So you need to know what to do about this if you're going to treat the obesity, right? And it's very interesting because we actually have an epidemic of obesity in neonates and these 6-month-olds. So this is a study from Kim, I think he was from Harvard or something. But when he looked at these 6-month-olds, they have tripled the obesity rate. That's very interesting because these kids are not walking, so there's no question of exercise, and they're drinking breast milk. So they're not eating a lot of calories, they're not eating a lot of carbs, they're just taking breast milk. Why are they so fat, right? David Ludwig also showed that there's an association between pregnancy weight gain and birth weight. So all these neonates have actually increased in weight about half a pound over the last 20, 25 years, right? And why? Why is that? Why are these neonates getting big? Well, the answer is the same thing drives infant obesity as adult obesity. It's insulin, right? So maternal insulin levels go up, infant insulin level goes up, and what you get is obesity. And that's not simply idle musings. What happens is that if you look at women who have gestational diabetes, the risk to the infant of having obesity is 3 times. So the problem is that obesity is a time-dependent mechanism, and we're now marinating these kids in insulin from the time before they've even gotten out, right? It's terrible. This is what happens. You get a big childhood obesity epidemic. That's exactly what we got. So that still doesn't answer our question. What's wrong with fructose, right? This is the thing, right? Sugar is equal parts glucose and fructose, right? But it's not about the sugar because the fructose doesn't raise the sugar. The glycemic index is very low, and that's why they thought it was so healthy, and it's naturally found in fruit, so great. But why does it cause so much obesity? And everybody knows this, right? They eat a lot of sugar, you're going to get fat. Eat a lot of candy, you're going to get fat, right? It's not a secret. But why is that? Well, it's because of the way that fructose is metabolized. So fructose is metabolized, for most intents and purposes, only in the liver, okay? So when you take a lot of glucose, what happens is that all the cells in the body can use it. So that's great. You disperse all that excessive glucose all over the place. When you take excessive fructose, it all goes to the liver. And what happens to that fructose? Well, you get a lot of triglycerides, de novo lipogenesis, and fatty liver. So it's the difference between pressing down with a needle and pressing down with a mallet, right? The excessive glucose can be dispersed throughout the body and can be burned off. That fructose cannot. So when you take excessive amounts, it's going to cause fatty liver because of the way it's metabolized, right? You're getting a lot of triglycerides, de novo lipogenesis. And what happens with that fatty liver is that you get insulin resistance. So we've known this for a long time. This is 1980. And what they did was they gave, I think, 10 people an extra 1,000 calories a day, either of glucose or fructose. And what happened, of course, is that you had 25% worse insulin resistance. So this is a glucose tolerance test. The insulin resistance was much worse. Why? Because you're getting all this fatty liver. And in 2009, Dr. Havel did this for a bunch of people. They gave them 25% of their calories either as glucose or fructose. They took Kool-Aid, they mixed it either with fructose or glucose. And what happened? Well, they did an oral glucose tolerance test, and lo and behold, you have insulin resistance. Not in the glucose group, only in the fructose group, right? because the glucose can still be dispersed. So the deadly effect of fructose is that it's not simply that it's a fattening carbohydrate, which it is. So the glucose is going to drive you this way. But the fructose itself is going to drive the insulin resistance. So now you're driving this cycle from the top, and you're driving the cycle from the bottom. So it's really twice as bad. Sugar is super obesogenic, which is why there's almost no disagreement that fructose is super, super bad for you. That's why Karin says sugar-free. That's why Prof. Noak says no sugar, because it's super obesogenic, right? And this explains why those Asian rice eaters didn't get fat. Yeah, there's a ton of glucose coming in this way, but there's no fructose coming in. And they didn't eat all the time like we did, right? They're not eating 6 times a day. So they're not getting insulin resistance. They're not getting fructose. All they've got is a bunch of glucose. And it's fine. What happens now? Well, they start eating all this sugar, because if you look at how much sugar people are eating, North America, interestingly, is stable. It's actually gone down a bit. But China has gone way up, right? Because now they're eating cakes and stuff like that. But they're still eating a lot of white rice. So what happens is that they're getting a ton of diabetes. I mean, in fact, if you look at per capita rates, China just recently passed the United States as the highest rate of diabetes in the world. I mean, holy, nobody passes the US, right? They're like the kings of diabetes, right? I mean, Mexico maybe, but this is the thing. Those Chinese people, once they got all that sugar and fructose, their diabetes went crazy. So what about fruits and vegetables? Because, fructose is in fruit. So you get this question a lot. What's the role of fiber? Because Dr. Lustig always says, oh, you got to take your fruit with fiber. You got to take your fructose with fiber. Is he like just out to lunch? I don't really think so. Because what's the effect of fiber? Well, the key to watch here is insulin. Fiber reduces insulin. So if you look at this study in the New England Journal in 2000, they gave a bunch of diabetics this liquid diet, right? So it's a standard liquid diet for diabetics. And they gave it either with fiber or no fiber. And what happens is that you can see that the insulin spikes are significantly decreased. So basically what is happening is that the fiber is lowering insulin. So it's a protective factor against obesity. It's a protective factor against diabetes, which is very interesting because probably with the only exception of honey, Mother Nature has packaged carbohydrate always with fiber. Always, right? In its natural form, there's fiber. When you start taking all the wheat germ off and stuff, yeah, you can get pure carbohydrate. But in its natural form, it's always packaged with fiber. That's not really an accident, right? It's almost, you can think of it as an antidote. You can think of the carbohydrate almost as a poison. It's not literally a poison, but you can think of this as an antidote, right? And what's interesting is that Dr. Willett at Harvard, when he does these nurses' health studies, looks at the risk of diabetes. And this is the same whether you look at the health professional study or what. But what's interesting is that you can look at a glycemic index diet. If you take a lot of this poison, but at the same time take a lot of this antidote, you have no increased risk of diabetes. It neutralizes it. If you take very low fiber diet, but at the same time you take a very low carb diet, you have low poison and low antidote, so fine. You don't have an increased risk. But what happens now when you start processing foods? You start removing the fat, you start removing the fiber, and adding sugar. Well, this is what happens, right? You go from here to here, high glycemic index, low fiber. And look, your risk of diabetes is now 75% higher, right? Because you're eating processed foods. That's the problem. David Ludwig also looked at this in the Cardia study, which was published in JAMA. And you can see, these are different tertiles of dietary fat. But what's interesting is that if you look at tertiles of fiber, so this is a low-fat group, you can see that it goes down. As you take more fiber, you have less obesity. This is a bunch of inner-city kids, and they followed them over 10 years and followed their weight gain. So clearly, the fiber is acting as a protective factor. If you look at Paleolithic diets, they are eating a ton of fiber, right? Because they aren't processing anything. So it's like 100 grams a day. Traditional diets, probably about 50 grams a day. USDA recommended about 25, and most of standard American diet, about 15. So this is exactly what's happening, right? Because this is from Andreas, from his website. If you look at what 30 grams of carbs look like, this is 30 grams of carbs, but there's a ton of fiber in there. You're not going to get fat eating this, right? You're not going to get fat eating carrots and beets, right? Because at the same time you got your carbs, you got your protective factors. But when you eat this hamburger bun, there's no protection. There's no protection. All you get is the poison. And that's the answer to the Katavans, right? So they're eating 70% carbohydrates, but it's all unprocessed, and there's no sugar, right? And their serum insulin levels are here. This is the reference range for 10 to 90%. These Katavans who are eating a 70% carbohydrate diet have an insulin level that is less than 5 percentile, right? So that means 95% of Swedish people have higher serum insulin levels. So they're eating a ton of carbs, but their insulin is low, and since their insulin is low, they don't have diabetes. So the toxicity is not really in the food, right? It's in the processing of that food. That's the key. You can eat natural foods. And what is it that Andreas is always talking about? What is it that Tim Noakes is always talking about? Like, what's the name of his book, right? The Real Meal Revolution. You got to eat unprocessed foods, right? Andreas says the same thing. You got to eat unprocessed foods. Zoe says the same thing, right? That's the first thing. Eat real food. You have to. Because if you look at what the standard American diet, the Western diet is, the key defining characteristic is actually not carbs or fat. It's the fact that it is highly processed. That is the major defining characteristic, right? We're not eating a lot of carrots. We're eating all this processed stuff, right? And that's the real problem, and that's the solution. But there's actually more than that. So this is the hormonal obesity theory, right? It's all about the hormones here. What's increasing? What's driving my insulin levels? That's the key question you have to ask. This is actually not complete by any means. We haven't talked about sleep deprivation, cortisol, protein, incretins. There's a ton of stuff that still goes on there. But you can see that there's more to it than this carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, because it was just incorrect. It didn't explain what was going on in the world. And that's why there's such debate, because they said, well, look at those Asians eating all that white rice. Well, it's true. Look at all those Katavans, they're eating carbs. It's true. They're not lying, right? They're treating these patients, they're not lying, but they're eating real foods. Nobody's saying eat white bread and sugar, right? But there's two things that are really important here. How are you going to get this down, right? Because if this is the key to obesity, right? This is what drives obesity and diabetes. Well, how are you going to get that down? Well, the answer is here, right? Low carb. You got to cut out those carbs. You got to increase the fiber, increase the fat, unprocessed foods. You cannot eat sugar, right? You simply cannot eat sugar if you want to lose weight, right? If you were to ask your grandmother, she'd say, well, of course. That's like the no-brainer, right? You can't eat sugar. The only people stupid enough to understand, to think that 100-calorie pack of Oreos is the same as 100 calories of broccoli, or all those caloric reduction people, right? All the CDCs and WHOs. They're the only people stupid enough to actually believe that. Who thinks you can eat ice cream for dinner. And I've read this somewhere. You can eat ice cream for dinner because it's the same calories. It's like, you're really stupid because it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. So you cannot eat sugar, right? That's what Karen's all about. No sugar. You cannot eat sugar. Absolutely correct. Here's the key, right? The diabetes. What are you going to do about this? Because this is a totally different question than what we talk about. This is all about what we're going to eat. The question of what to eat. This is not. This is a question of when to eat. Because remember, you're talking about the persistence of those levels. So, if you need persistence, then what you need is a period of very low insulin levels to prevent the insulin resistance. So, what do? Well, you can go back to the 70s. You can say, well, 3 meals, no snacks. That's a pretty good start. Better? 2 meals, right? I think I heard in a lecture Prof. Noakes say that you should only eat once or twice a day. So better than 2 meals a day, 1 meal a day. What's even better than that? 0 meals a day. And I see you're like, whoa, this fun guy, he's crazy. But am I? Really? Do you have to eat? If you do a colonoscopy, right, this is what you're getting at, and you have to fast for a day, you don't keel over and die, right? If you do it once in a while, it's got huge benefits, right? If you've got so much of this going on, you need a long period of low insulin. But that's not going to come right away, right? It's a meal timing problem. And that's the part we never talk about, right? We talk all obsessively about what to eat, right? But we never talk about when to eat. And the question again is that, can you stick to it? Well, there are literally billions of people in the world who fast on a regular basis, right? So Muslims, for instance, will fast twice a week, Monday and Thursday. Buddhists will fast almost every day from 12 till the next day. They don't eat after lunch. The Mormons fast once a month. Catholics, we're supposed to fast once a week, but we don't. Greek Orthodox, they are big believers in fasting. So literally, billions of people in the world have done this for their entire lives. So if you want to say, can you do it? Of course you can do it. There is no reason why you can't do it. Now, if you're on a ton of insulin, you have to be careful, right? But that's the thing. It's not as crazy as it sounds. I think that's the last slide. So that's the real key to obesity. So that's what, I mean, none of this is proven. What you have to do is really think about it, because this explains a lot more about obesity than this, right? Everybody has a problem with this, right? All the calorie people, because there are holes in it. But what you have to do is take those anomalies. Remember Gary Taubes, so smart. I mean, he was talking about how they build these billion-dollar accelerometers, because you got to look for those anomalies and say, what is it that's wrong with this picture? And how am I going to fix it? Well, this is the thing, right? This is the thing what we're going to talk about tomorrow, which is that the insulin actually drives the resistance. So what are we doing? We're giving them insulin. Well, that's not going to work, right? If you're going to give insulin, it's just going to drive more resistance. I think that's it. Thank you.